Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Jamie Anderson with her brand new book, Drive All Day, because I'm too old to drive all night. Jamie's here in conversation with one of our favorite Atlantans, Bucky Motter. Bucky has celebrated multiple Charis events with us, many important Charis birthdays and celebrations. We are really, really excited to have Bucky helping us launch this book into the world for Atlanta. Jamie Anderson is the author of 3 books, including the memoir that we are celebrating tonight, as well as an Army of Lovers, which was about women's music of the 80s and 90s. Both were finalists for the GCLS Goldie Awards. She's a music journalist writing for a plethora of publications and websites. Her favorite word is plethora. Jamie is a performing musician with 12 albums, a winner of dozens of music awards. She has yet to win a Grammy or a Juno, although she can play the ukulele behind her head while hula hooping. So really, that's unjust. Jamie did her first tour in 1987 because she needed to earn money to get to a music festival. Thousands of gigs later, she's still collecting tiny motel soaps. Also a music teacher with a popular YouTube channel, she lives with 2 cats and her long-suffering wife in Ottawa, Canada, when she isn't busy escaping the cold in Tucson, Arizona. And so, we're joined by Bucky Motter, who is a genderqueer performing songwriter and rocker. He's a veteran of the Atlanta music scene and has opened for such artists as B.B. King, the Indigo Girls, Melissa Farrick, Dory Roberts, Sonia Lee, and the Manhattan Transfer. He has 2 critically acclaimed CDs, Out of Control and Pleasure and Pain, on his own Hey Mister Records label. Currently, he is playing his own music with his beloved bassist Jerry Peak and playing bass and co-writing with the Atlanta power pop band Flat Cat. So, welcome to everybody. Thank you for being with us. We are really excited to hear Drive All Day because I'm too old to drive all night. So, I'm going to encourage folks, if you want to ask questions, whether you're virtual with us tonight or in person, we want you to do that. If you're in person, just raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you. And if you're virtual, just pop your questions in the chat. And when the time comes, I will vocalize your questions so that everyone can hear them. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Bucky and we're going to get this party started. But please put your hands together for Jamie Anderson.
Thank you.
Hey, Jamie.
Hey, Bucky. How you doing?
Oh, great. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
I've really enjoyed your book and
Thank you.
So many great stories. And I have some questions for you that I'll ask. But first, I think you ought to read something for us.
All right. Happy to do that. This chapter is called Hallelujah. When I first got the day hospice gig, I envisioned beds filled with weak-looking people, surrounded by solemn loved ones, my soothing music helping them rest. Turned out they'd rather hear 8 days a week or Wagon Wheel. I played in a comfortable living room, not a bed in sight. There was usually a raucous card game going on as a volunteer pushed a cart with snacks and juice served in elegant wine glasses. I always looked for Andrew when I arrived for my shift. When I first met him a year ago, a middle-aged white guy in casual clothes, brown hair carefully combed to the side, he was thin and moving slowly. Even though he kidded me about the ukulele, he sometimes looked my way and smiled when I did a song he liked. Turned out, he just liked to hassle me because he played a superior instrument, the guitar. After being away for the summer, I came into the living room. I moved a chair, unfolded the music stand, and pulled the ukulele out of the case. While I tuned, I looked around for Andrew. When I didn't see him, my first thought was, did he pass? I always wondered when I saw someone one week and not the next. It could simply be that they recovered or went to another hospice. However, it could be the inevitable. 15 minutes passed before Andrew strolled into the room with an energetic step. He looked better than that first time, his color robust, so my thoughts switched to something more positive. Maybe he was recovering. I didn't know anything about Andrew's health. We weren't allowed to ask why the clients were there unless they brought it up. We only provided art projects, card games, food, massage, and music. I was usually background music to a decibel busting card game. Someone played a good hand and they all screamed with laughter, then pointed fingers at Andrew, accusing him of having cards up his sleeve. I didn't care that they found euchre more interesting than my music. They were there to enjoy themselves and perhaps forget about pain and hospitals and what their last test revealed. Once in a while, I saw a foot tapping or lips moving to the lyrics. Sometimes they clapped after I finished a song. Usually they didn't. They didn't know I'd toured over 30 years or that I recorded 13 albums. It didn't matter. Andrew told me he liked Creedence Clearwater Revival, so one week I brought in songs for him. Partway through Bad Moon Rising, I realized it was one of those songs where you really don't hear the lyrics until you sing them. There I was, cheerfully singing about rage and ruin at the end of the world when I realized that one verse was enough. I switched to Down on the Corner. An upbeat song about buskers was much better. One week I brought the guitar. Andrew grinned and commented, "You brought the big boy." "Big girl," I corrected, and we laughed. I'm good at faces, bad at names. I remember Andrew because he was there every time. He doesn't always recall my name, and sometimes he looks confused when I bring up his guitar playing, like he can't fathom how I know that he plays. Some weeks we've had conversations about kinds of music and guitars, but his meds probably scramble his brain. As long as he enjoys our talks in the moment, it's good. One day, Andrew was in the parking lot smoking a cigarette when I walked up for my gig. "Oh, good, it's you," he said in between puffs. "When it's not you, that lady with the harp shows up, and I'm not ready for that yet." One day, an elderly gentleman slowly lowered himself into a recliner near me. A volunteer covered his lap with a blanket. He confided that he couldn't sing or remember the words to anything. I assured him that it didn't matter. When I got to the chorus of Brown-Eyed Girl, I invited him to sing. He softly sang along in a creaky voice. La 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 dee da. "See, you can remember the words," I complimented him. A smile lit up his face. A young woman in her 30s was often there. She wore a turban and sat next to an oxygen tank. As I was packing up one day, she smiled and commented that she liked those old songs. Old songs? Did she not hear me play Riptide? Okay. Okay, one song out of 30 written after 1980 did not count. I had to give my musician's ego a firm "down, girl." I was strumming a rhythmic song one day and looked up to see a thin woman, half her jaw missing, but still smiling and bouncing up and down. "I love that song," she exclaimed after I was done, telling me how much she loved that band. "Do you know anything else by them?" I didn't, but she was happy to boogie along with the next song I did. I only saw her that one time. The volunteers, mostly older women, were sweet. They sat near clients, talking, or simply sitting in silence. One gave hand massages. One, in her 80s, was usually dressed in pastels, her white hair carefully curled. She clapped to my faster songs, usually offbeat. She sang, even when she didn't know the words. The clients were fairly mobile, some using a wheelchair or walker, and were only there for the day. We got them out of their house, gave their caretakers a break, and offered social time and something to do. One day, one of the volunteers leaned down to me between songs and quietly said, "A client passed in one of the back rooms. He'll be wheeled down the hallway, and when that happens, there's a moment of silence." A few minutes later, she said softly, "It's time." I'd been singing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. I stopped, the last chord gently falling away. We all turned toward the hall as a group of people, heads bowed, pushed a covered gurney slowly by. A minute later, the boisterous card game resumed, and I finished Hallelujah, fighting tears. Thanks.
Wow. I read it already, but it's just as touching as when I first read it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I got a basic question for you. You talk so much about music and teaching in this book. What is your definition of music?
Oh, easy questions, Bucky. Thank you. Music. It's a beautiful sound that brings forth emotions and well-being.
That's what the Greeks said. So you're right on the money.
I think they're right. Yeah.
My second year music theory teacher would say that at its most basic, music is sound organized in time.
Oh, I like that.
But it doesn't take into account the emotional part of it. And when I ask people what their definition of music is, especially kids, like when I do the girls rock camp or the y'all rock camp, they always talk about their emotions and their feelings.
Yeah.
And so that's what, a lot of that stuff came up for me, and we're very close in age. So it came up, my notes are on my phone. I'm not checking my email. But a lot of stuff came up for me in terms of who my first influences were and stuff like that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that with you.
Sure.
The first thing I want to ask you, though, is how do you remember those stories that you tell in this book?
I keep a journal.
That's what I thought. That's what I put here. I was thinking maybe you kept a journal.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, it's such a cool thing because they're very detailed, and so many musicians and have revered so many musicians who are also your peers, and I love reading about that.
Thank you.
So tell people how old you were when you started playing guitar.
I taught myself to play the guitar when I was 15. My dad was a guitar player, and he just had guitars everywhere. I joke that if he'd been a jazz drummer, I probably would have been a drummer. And I took one of his guitars and learned every chord in a Hal Leonard book, Joni Mitchell, folk songs and stuff like that. I was also a Girl Scout, and Girl Scouts sing all the time. We sing when we're hiking, when we're doing dishes, when we're setting up the tent. And usually they're pretty simple folk songs, and those are really great songs to learn on. In fact, some of my students today learn to play with those songs. And I've always loved music. I've always loved to sing. So suddenly I had this thing that I could do and sing at the same time. Wow.
Yeah. I have another question. Do I have salad in my teeth?
You're good.
Thank you.
Do I have salad in my
No,
teeth?
you look
Okay.
good. But she didn't have salad.
Oh, that's true. Okay.
We just ate dinner, so at the U joint. So you started at 15. What age did you start writing songs? And my guess is you're going to say 15.
15.
Yeah.
Yeah, but back then I didn't think that I could write a whole song by myself. And so my first girlfriend was a poet. And so my first songs, I put her poetry to music. And she loved old country songs. And so she wrote in this really even meter that made it pretty easy to play those three chords and to make a song out of it. They were beginning songs. And so, they weren't really very good, but it got me started. And then after high school is when I started writing more on my own.
Yeah. That's about the trajectory for me. I started at age 10 and wrote philosophical songs at age 10, which I think is really hilarious. And some of the melodies I can still remember, which is crazy.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I can't remember the words or the chords, but the melodies I remember. And I thought, well, that was a pretty crappy melody. Okay, so you wrote that Carole King was an influence. Am I correct?
Oh, she was a big influence. Yeah.
Yeah. The album Tapestry was a huge influence on me.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing it. My mom bought it, actually. And we were downstairs where the stereo was. And I started crying. And I said, Mom, do you think I'll ever write songs like that?
Wow.
And she said, sure, honey, you will. I mean, just like any good mom says,
Yeah, but still, yay, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. And that was going to be the lead in. There's a follow-up question, but tell us about your influences and your influences now.
Well, I was really honored or lucky to be exposed to artists like Carole King. And one of my friends in the block, her mom was like cool and hip and listened to the Doors and the Fifth Dimension, and she had all those albums. And so I spent a lot of time at their house listening to those. I mean, I was also a kid. I also listened to the Monkees and the Archies and, everything kids listen to. And, but, being exposed to great artists like that, when I discovered James Taylor and Joni Mitchell, it was an epiphany. Later on, I'm really a singer-songwriter person. So, John Armour-Trading and, I could just, it's a long, long list. But they're all such great songwriters. And that's, I think, why I value songwriting above everything else in what I do. I appreciate a pretty voice. I appreciate a good player. It's not that isn't important, but I think it's that early exposure. And today, I think Adele is the bomb. She does everything. She can sing, she can write. She's just so honest and so right there. Brandi Carlile, I love. I'm just going to name a whole list of singer-songwriters here. So, I mean, I'll stop now, but I also listen to a lot of country and bluegrass. I love Dolly Parton, especially her bluegrass albums. One of the best shows I ever went to was a Dolly Parton show. Cool. She's still kicking butt and taking names. And
she just released a rock album.
She did. I have, and it's a little disconcerting, actually. It's like, she's got all the elements there. I think I need to listen to it more to sort of like slide into it.
Yeah, she did a great cover of the Collective Soul song. Is it Shine, I think? It was featured in The Righteous Gemstones. I don't know if you've seen The Righteous Gemstones. I
love The Righteous Gemstones.
Oh my God, I could talk about that tonight.
I can't believe the things they got away with.
Oh, it was terrible. It's terrible. It's just so hard to watch, but so wonderful. And anyway, yeah.
For those of you who don't know, the Mighty Gemstones is this parody of mainstream Christian schlocky stuff. Not the cool Christians. The
mega churches and the
mega churches. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Who was your first concert?
My first concert. It was a classical concert. Something at Arizona State University. There was this great program in my grade school where we learned about these classical pieces, and then we went to go hear them play live.
Nice.
And I couldn't tell you any other details, but I was so moved by the whole experience to hear a whole symphony play like that. I think beyond that, my first concert that I just went to on my own that wasn't part of school was John Denver.
Nice.
John Denver.
How was it?
Oh my God. I was a huge fan. I sang along to every song until the lady beside me said, "We came to hear him." Okay. But he was a great songwriter. He introduced me to bluegrass, which I still love to this day. So I'm grateful to him for that. And then after high school, I know I'm sort of going on here, but after high school, I worked for a record distributor, and we used to get free tickets, and I got to hear the Tops and Jerry Jeff Walker. That's where I first saw Carole King. I mean, some amazing concerts.
That's great. Yeah, Carole King was my first concert. My dad brought me.
Your dad?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, my dad is a weird character because he had long hair and a beard. Well, sometimes he had a beard, sometimes he didn't. But he's a Republican, and he always has been. And he fooled me. I didn't know as a kid what he was. And it wasn't until I grew up and realized, that he's kind of in the enemy camp. And that was sort of hard to deal with because he was the cool dad, everybody wanted to hang out with him. But my brother listened to a lot of music. Once we moved the stereo out of the room that Carole King was playing in, it moved into his bedroom. So, anything from James Taylor to Yes was being played. But he went through a Joni Mitchell stage that I also kind of, kept that stage going. So, and I'll be honest, when I was listening to Joni Mitchell, I didn't really understand a lot of her music. I was just kind of like, wow, that's just beautiful the way she said that, but I'm not quite sure how that relates to me. But of course, as an adult, I became more, savvy and aware of what she was writing about. But anyway, but yeah, Carole King was my first concert. Let's see, which one do I want to ask next? I had a follow-up and I don't remember what it was. Who taught you to be such a great teacher?
Thank you for calling me a great teacher. I appreciate that. Well, Girl Scouts is where it started because we had all those great folk songs even before I was playing songs, and we learned about teaching a whole group a song, call and response, saying the words, all those different techniques, repetition, and that sort of got me started. And then when I started teaching, I just remembered what it was like to learn the guitar. I remember playing two chords back and forth over and over again until finally I could change them. I remembered trying to sing and play at the same time and how hard that was. And what helped me was learning the song, putting it in my hands first, and then singing it and putting it together. And I still use those techniques with my students. So I try to put myself in their place. I think also what makes me, if I may brag, a good teacher is that I see what they want. I've never had this agenda where it's like, okay, you must learn this, this, and this. It's like, okay, well, who do you like? What do you want to learn? And I try to be realistic. It's like, okay, if you've never played before, you don't want to start off with Jimi Hendrix. Not that I can play much of Hendrix's stuff. I mean, I can play a few of the basic chords, but, so I get them to a place of where they are and they're excited about it because they've got to be excited about playing.
Yeah. So 2 questions about the F chord. For those of you who don't know, on the guitar, the F is a very difficult chord. One of my students calls it the effing F. So my 2 questions are, how long did it take you to learn the F chord? And when, it's like we're talking about the F word, and how long, like when do you introduce the F chord with your students?
If it's a rank beginner, I don't do the F chord right away because I want them to feel empowered with what they know. And the F chord is a little harder, and I call it the F and F chord too. In fact, I tell my students we have a lot of F names, but I prefer fantastic and fabulous. And I think with the F chord is hard, but it's just like anything else with guitar. It's just like doing it over and over again and, helping them with, how to hold their hands and stuff like that. And I do introduce it fairly early if they've been playing for a little while, because I think it's an important thing to do. There's if you play in the key of C, inevitably there's going to be an F. So you've got to learn how to play an F. And I do have a few students who go, well, I only want to learn songs that don't have an F in it. Or do we have to do the F now? Yes, we do. And the key, I think, is them learning a song that they really, really like, but it's got an F in it.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, that really works for me too.
Yeah.
Who are your teachers? Like whether they're musicians or novelists, or who are your teachers?
Well, in terms of writing, I read like a crazy person. I read several books a week.
Wow.
And I'm a big fan of Margaret Atwood and Marge Piercy, Amy Tan. I just, those vivid narratives. And I don't write fiction, but I want my words to jump out of the page like that. I've read a few books recently, like Stephen King's novel about writing is phenomenal. I'm not even a fan of his. I don't like horror. It keeps me up at night. But I really like the way that he writes and the matter-of-fact way that he writes. And so that particular book has been an inspiration. In terms of music, I just listen to so many different kinds of music. And there have been times when I've stopped somebody in person and said, well, obviously not a stage audience situation like in a jam. And how did you do that? Or sometimes it's as simple as, what key are you playing that in? What's that riff? And they'll, and people are flattered when you ask them,
Sure.
Or sometimes I just watch them really close, and I teach my students to do that too.
That's great. I guess there's always teachers for us. And as you and I both know, the students always teaching me as well, because they turn me on to new music and, stuff that I have never heard before, which is really, really awesome. And it's fun to figure it out and see, because if you do that to enough of that same artist's songs, you can kind of predict what is going to happen. I mean, even with James Taylor, he has certain licks that that he does, you know, over and over.
Yeah, my students bring me everything from punk to bluegrass. And when I started teaching, I only knew my own songs and a few folk songs from Girl Scouts. That was it.
Yeah. I'm going to stop to see if we have any questions from the peanut gallery. Go ahead. Okay, we do have a question here.
How many questions am I allowed to ask?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Do you feel happy with your accomplishments? Because I know like writing a book is such a big achievement. So do you currently feel happy, satisfied?
You know, I am very satisfied. There's something about, you know, taking your inner thoughts and putting them out on a piece of paper in a way that other people are going to want to read. You know, that could be moving, it could be entertaining, and it's pretty exciting. And you know, when the physical part, I mean, I know everything's digital these days, but when you just hold it in your hands, I mean, when I made my first album, when I held that in my hands, I mean, was it the same for you?
Definitely.
It's like, look what we did, you know?
Yeah, that's a great feeling.
Yeah, and if you don't feel that way after you finished, then you need to go back and look at the process, because you should be happy with what you do. Are you a writer then? Is that why you asked?
Oh,
No? Oh, okay.
I just have like a list of questions, and like while you were talking, I was kind of making a list.
Oh, okay, great.
All right. So I know you mentioned working in a hospice.
Yeah,
I think
it was a day hospice.
And when you kind of talked about the guy coming out when he was dead, it kind of piqued my interest because I'm in psychology and a lot of people deal with loss in a different way. So kind of how do you deal with it?
Wow, well, that requires a lot of thought. Yeah.
So,
Well, I think working in that day hospice really made me think about death, actually, because, you know, like I said in the beginning of that chapter, I thought, you know, it was going to be this very somber, you know, deep thinking kind of thing. And instead, they were like screaming and jumping up and down and telling jokes and accusing Andrew of cheating. And, you know, they were just living their life. And I recently had the pleasure of opening for Holly Near at a show. And she said, you know, and she's been through a lot of health issues recently. And she said, in the end, you live until you die. I thought, that's a really great way to look at it.
Thanks.
Got one more? Okay. I'm like, what made you want to write? Did you ask that?
Nope.
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What made you want to write?
You know, I also do a lot of comedy, and I joke that because I've written 2 memoirs, I just like talking about myself. but you know, there's just a lot of great material in my head, I feel like, so I just want to get it out there. And also, you know, with Drive All Day and also with my first memoir, Drive All Night, I wanted people to know what it's like for an independent musician. A lot of people don't know. And, you know, Bucky and I were talking about that earlier at dinner. You know, they think it's all, you know, tour buses and massage people traveling with you. And it's just me in a car by myself trying to find the venue.
I'm hoping it's still open.
Oh, I've had a couple close on me. Yeah. So I think, you know, I've always been a creative person, and that's just one more way to be creative.
So we have a question from Nell Ruby. Nell says, my first album, Love, Sing Along, Power Rocker, was also Carole King's Tapestry. I was really moved when I watched Aretha Franklin play Natural Woman at the Kennedy Center honors ceremony with Carole King in the audience. I was bawling. were you bawling too? Can you say anything about your songs being covered, good or bad?
Yeah, I was crying too. I mean,
Oh yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Carol was so moved. I mean, to have Aretha Franklin sing your song, let's just start there. Um, yeah, I was at an open mic at a women's music festival one time, and a young woman who didn't play an instrument got up and sang my song "Dark Chocolate" a cappella. Dark
Wow.
Chocolate is a love song that's kind of sensual, and it was so moving. And at first, I was like, "That's I wrote that," and I was so flattered that she chose that song and that she did such an interesting interpretation of it. That was really cool. And then I have a song about breast cancer called "One Out of Three" that my friends Justina and Joyce recorded, and they had these beautiful harmonies, and it just made me relive all those experiences. So it's very cool. It's quite an honor when someone covers your songs.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
I love that. Anything else from the
Cindy Lutenbacher says 1 out of 3 is so amazing. And Jamie, you're such a great storyteller in songs and in talk.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
How about your family? Were they supportive of you from the beginning in terms of, because you've been a touring musician for a long time. I mean, I don't think of you as a person who had a day job.
Oh, I've had a lot of day jobs.
Well, I've done a lot of weird
Oh yeah, I've done
stuff to support my music habit.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, before I made my first album, I had a lot of really crummy day jobs, not for very long because I wanted to retain my sanity.
Right.
But yeah, I have toured for a long time, and since I put out my first album in the late '80s, everything I've done has been music oriented. So, I was a music journalist. I wrote bios for musicians for a while. I've worked for several music magazines. I produced concerts. I was a radio DJ. I worked for a record distributor back in the '80s. I've done a lot of things, and it's music. So it's still music, even if I'm not on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the question?
Well, I started out actually, I think I started the question and then stopped the question, which is how was your family supportive of
my
these?
family, right.
Yeah.
I knew there was some
No,
other
I'm
element.
sorry. That was my fault.
No, it wasn't. My dad was always really proud of me. I think in his heart of hearts, he would have wanted to be a professional musician. And first I had to come out to them because I was writing lesbian songs and I wasn't out to my family initially. And I came out to them in 1989 by sending them my first album. Not a method I recommend.
Honey.
Yeah. But, and that's when I started inviting them to my concerts. And at that point, most of my concerts were lesbian crowds. And so there'd be all these lesbians and then there'd be my family. And I remember at one early show, and it was a pretty big show. It was at a theater. And my brother came backstage at the break and he said, "There's no men here." And I said, "Well, yeah, there are. There's 2 men in the front row." "Yeah, but they're gay." I was like, okay. Now, mind you, my brother is 6'2", covered in tattoos, and rides a Harley. Wow. And he was threatened by these 2 gay men. And I think in the end he enjoyed the show, but and then I could always hear my dad laughing. I do a lot of comedy in my shows, and I could hear, a whole bunch of women laughing, and then I'd hear, ho, 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 ho.
That's great.
Yeah.
So the women's music festival scene, you speak very fondly of it, and I had the good fortune to play every Rhythm Fest. And Rhythm Fest moved around; it wasn't just in one place. And I got to play the night stage once on a Thursday night, and I always volunteered there because I feel like volunteering is a way to kind of get involved in the event and not feel isolated, because it was sort of like camp to me at first, like, oh my God, I don't know anybody. And, I was there with my girlfriend or whatever, or by myself. And, getting involved. And so I was driving, for some reason they asked me to drive the accessible van. And so people were like, "Oh, we didn't know you sang. You're the van driver, right?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's me. I'm the accessible van driver." Nobody knew who I was.
Oh.
So, but I loved that, when I identified as purely a lesbian, that was so amazing to me. Those times were so heady, and
Yeah.
and just seeing women do all the work on the land, and which is called the land. We call it the land. But it was very good for me to see, the crew, the tech, everybody down the line. And it was just very life-changing for me. So I guess the question is, what do you find, or have you found life-changing about the festivals?
Well, the women's music festivals taught me that I could be a musician on a big stage. It taught me that women could run sound. It taught me that women could play drums in a rock band. It just taught me so many things. And it gave us the space that we didn't have. I mean, when I came out in the 90s, there was the bars, and that was it.
Mhm.
And that was empowering in its way. But when you combine music and all those women together, it was like, I felt like I'd found nirvana. And
Mhm.
really, if it hadn't been for the women's music festivals, I wouldn't be here. I would have set my guitar aside. I wouldn't be a guitar teacher. I wouldn't have written these books.
Mm. Yeah, that's a big influence.
Yeah.
And I know some of our great musicians have passed, and you were able to write about some of those people, or one in particular, I can't remember her name, who you wrote the book and then she passed. I think
Is she in
before
this
it came
book?
out. Yes.
Or is she? Oh, okay.
Yes.
So it's probably Alex Dobkin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, which brings me to I just forgot the name of the book about
An Army of Lovers.
Yes, An Army of Lovers. You have that book, and you have Drive All Night, right? Those are the 3 books.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about Army of Lovers.
An Army of Lovers is about women's music of the 70s and 80s. And then I have a quick chapter about the 90s. And I wanted to write about women's music from the beginning, but there was so much, it would have been, several books, and I needed to stop somewhere. But what happened is that, for those of you who don't know about women's music was this phenomenon that started in the 70s, and it was completely run by women. And all the performers were women. Everyone was women, and that was different. And the reason that it started is because mainstream music wasn't supporting us. There were very few women. There was like Joan Baez and a few rock bands like Fanny, but even they didn't make the top 40. So actually, I might hear from June Millington about that, because I think maybe they close to the top 40. But at any rate, so there wasn't support for women's music. And I kept saying, and women's music was very important to me. It was a soundtrack to my coming out, the soundtrack to my being a feminist. And I kept saying, why doesn't anyone write a book about women's music? And then I realized that someone was me. And I started doing interviews. I did over 100 interviews of performers, producers, DJs, all kinds of people in women's music. And I wrote the book. It took me 8 years to write it. But it was well worth that, and I'm really proud of that book. And it's been used in a few university classes, which I am honored, because I'm not an academic, but I was very careful with all of the information. Everything is supported. And then Drive All Day was my first book, and that's a collection of stories from the road. And that one started because I was having dinner with a couple of members of my audience. They'd heard me the night before, and I was just telling them road stories.
Mm-hmm.
We all have those stories about
Mm-hmm.
those gigs that we had, and some of them are funny, some of them are a little tragic, and they were laughing so hard they could hardly swallow their breakfast. And I thought, well, maybe this is entertaining enough for someone else. And so I started writing the book then, and I put together Drive All Night. And I kind of regret having 2 books with a similar title, but I thought Drive All Day, because I'm too old to drive all night, was funny.
It is funny and true. I have to give a shout out to Charis at this point, because one of my friends, when I was in college, I started out as an English major, and then I switched to music, a music major, and I ended up with a degree in classical guitar performance from Georgia State. I started at Kennesaw College, and which is now Kennesaw State University. It bears no resemblance to Kennesaw College whatsoever. I don't know what they did with those small buildings. They might have just picked them up and moved them away. I don't know. But one of my friends bought me The Changer and the Changed, and she was straight. And she bought it at Charis, and back when Charis was in little 5 points. And that was a real big deal for me. And Hotwire was out. I don't remember when Hotwire started, but that magazine, I just remember when it came out, it was like, oh my God, it's Hotwire, you know, and it had the, if I remember correctly, they would send out the plastic records.
There was a record inside.
Yeah, and Hotwire. And it was just so cool, you know. So shout out to Charis for their, you know, for helping me, you know, hear one of the most influential, you know, lesbian albums that there is. Yeah. I have other questions, but if anybody else wants to ask anything. I'm assuming we're going till 8:30, right? Okay.
I just want to know, when you're writing one of the 3 books, are you taking time off the road and like sitting down and dedicated to writing, or are you writing while you're, you know, traveling like at night in a hotel?
The 2 memoirs were written just when I had spare time, you know. For a while, I had a blog that I was writing contributions to. In fact, part of Drive All Day came from my blog, which is called Jamie Bobamy. I wished I'd been able to like just go to a cabin somewhere for a month and write, but you know, my circumstances wouldn't allow that. Now, for An Army of Lovers, the women's music book, that was so labor intensive. You know, all the interviews and fact checking and everything that I had to do. I went to my mom's. That's where you go, right? You go to mom's. And I took some time off from teaching. And my wife is a humanitarian, and she was doing a mission overseas. So she was gone for a whole year. So I sat on my mom's guest bed, and I wrote for a couple of months straight. And, you know, I'd write until I ran out of steam. And about mid-afternoon, Mom would come in and ask me if I wanted an iced coffee. And then at night, her husband cooked dinner. So it was kind of like a writer's retreat, right? You know, I had coffee and dinner and a lot of support. You know, you asked about my family earlier. You know, my family's always been extremely supportive with, you know, everything that I've done. And I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, I think my dad was not, well, I know he wasn't happy that I decided to go to music school. He's a graphic artist by trade, and he wanted me to go to work for him because I had worked with him some in high school. Well, actually before high school, I was helping him do mechanicals back before computers. And he was paying me very well. I mean, he was really, you know, trying to reel me in. And I had a teacher, John Sutherland, who said to me, you know, if there's something else you want to do with your life, you need to go do it. And he said, I will teach you, but you need to think about that first. And if your answer is that you want to do music above everything else, and he told me, you know, you're going to have energy. You're going to have a lot of irons in the fire. You have to be, you know, this, and this. If you're going to do this in school, this is, you know, you've got to practice. You've got to learn to play the piano, which I didn't. I don't know how they passed me in piano proficiency, but I think they just felt for me and passed me. But anyway, so I think my dad was very disappointed that I chose music school until he came to see Jerry and I open for Manhattan Transfer. And he kind of said, "You're really good." I'm like,
was that a surprise?
You know, so yeah, that it's really cool to hear how supportive your family has been and is of
Well,
you.
it's puzzling to me that, you were going to college. I mean, for
Right.
school. It wasn't just that you decided to play in dumpy bars.
Well,
I mean, that
well,
didn't
the
mean
irony
anything?
was that my grandfather's estate is what paid. My dad didn't pay a penny for me to go to college.
Oh.
He would not do that. So, so it was, felt by me, oh, wow, this is something that I'm doing. However, my mother, I would be down there playing Segovia scales, and my mother would come down into my bedroom because I spent the first 2 years of college at home, and she'd fall asleep to me playing scales, and she just loved it. She'd have like this cherubic smile on her face and would fall asleep, or playing Carcassi etudes or just whatever I was working on at the time.
Wow.
So she was very, very supportive, and she just thought we could do anything. So that I really appreciated.
Yeah. Yeah. And the advice that you got about, finding your passion, you were lucky to have someone like that in your life, because, when you decide to do art, you don't always get that. Art is not a real job, right? And what really helped me was my first girlfriend. I was finishing up college. I have a business degree, which was useless. But anyway, I have a business degree. And she said, don't you want to do music for a living? And at the time I'd done, a few weddings and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't want to play wedding song. Forget it. And she said, you don't want to wake up when you're 80 and say, I wished I'd tried that.
Right.
And that stayed with me. And
Yeah,
I still
it's
quote that to
beautiful.
people,
It's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
And what about that wedding song that went na 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 na.
It is that one.
You know the one I'm talking
Yes, I
about?
do.
What was up with that
He is
song?
now to be among you at the calling of your heart. There was one different note in there.
yeah. Da-da.
Oh, I hated that
And now
song.
we have Ed Sheeran who writes songs like Perfect and, stuff like that, which is pretty cool.
We have two more questions, one virtual and then one here in person. So
Okay.
Carol CJ, who is the wonderful editor
Oh,
of the Feminist
Carol,
Bookstore News
hi.
Network,
Yeah.
asks or says, exclaims, 100 interviews. What did you do with all the stories that didn't fit into an army of lovers? How did you choose what to use and what to leave out? And is there a home for all the other stories?
Oh, Carol, you were asking all these hard
Kill
questions
me,
tonight.
kill me.
Well, it figures someone who is so involved with bookstores would want to know that. I don't know. I've got them all on a flash drive, and recently I donated a bunch of stuff to 2 archives, and maybe those should go too. I don't have releases for all of them though, so that would be kind of tricky. How I decided what to include in that book, it was almost a stream of consciousness. It was like, okay, I just interviewed, Holly Near. Oh, she talked about accessibility. Well, I'll put her in the accessibility section, and then I'll put her over here. And it just sort of dovetailed together. So if I thought that someone said something relevant to what someone else said, I put it in there. But that was hard because it could have been a much longer book.
You should put it in the archive. You really should. People, even if you don't have the rights to all of it,
Yeah.
let the archivist sort that out.
That's a good idea.
For real. Like that's what they're paid to do,
I could do that.
because people want some student would love to.
Because we had some wonderful conversations, just amazing, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'd love to hear both of you, Jamie, especially talk about the diversity in the women's music scene, because I think that it really breaks the stereotypes of, like white women's feminism or like sort of a purely white lesbian culture or something like that. The first time I went to a women's music festival, the first thing I heard was Toshi Regan and, Sweet Honey, all the kind of just sort of the interchange of the, Latina performers, taiko drumming, international. And I think it was, at least from the 80s on, just really, kind of leading edge around diversity and having an of course, a women of color spaces, anti-racism spaces. And I would just love to hear you talk about your reflections about that too.
Well, as a white woman who grew up in a white suburb of Phoenix, I knew almost nothing about other cultures and, people of color. And so when I found the women's music festival scene and when I found feminism, I learned so much. Now, in the very beginning of women's music, it was very white. It was Holly Near, Chris Williamson, Meg Christian, and they realized something was wrong and worked for that. Plus, there were women of color who came in and said, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And so starting in the 80s was when we really started to see more women of color. I also learned a lot about ableism. I learned a lot about deaf culture. Women's music just opened up so many things to me. And part of the problem with women's music, though, is that, and it's true of all music, is that solo performers or even duos sometimes are better known because it's easier for us to tour. It's easier for us to make money and to stay together. A lot of what, especially the African-American women did, like Sweet Honey in the Rock or what Linda Tillery did, Linda doesn't do many solo things. She needs a band. And so to keep a band together and to pay a band was really difficult. So mostly that was something that we saw at festivals. I still learned and it was still great to hear them, but I would have liked more. But maybe it was the economics, maybe it was racism, maybe it was a lot of things.
Yeah, ditto. I mean, I would totally agree with that. And I think that there was a space made, for Black and brown people eventually, I think you're right. It did start out. I always joke that I was a WG squared white girl with guitar, and so, yeah, I mean, I think it's still going on. I mean, obviously it's endemic racism and, trying to create space for people of color and indigenous cultures and things like that. I played a festival in Canada a while back in Toronto, and I was one of the few white people there, and I was like, hallelujah,
Yeah.
let's do this right. So that felt really good.
I mean, a lot of those performers still, I'm finding them on Spotify. So you mentioned Toronto. I don't know if you know Lillian Allen,
Mm-mm.
but she's
on Spotify.
Black dub poet.
Mhm.
Nice.
Very radical, really fun, sort of reggae. Toshi is still,
Mm-hmm.
touring and stuff. So it's cool to see the new venues, the new platforms becoming a place for some of those artists to, kind of find a new audience.
Yeah, and you mentioned Spotify. I have a chapter about Spotify in my new book. We'll bring it back to the book. Spotify is evil.
Yeah.
I mean, Spotify is good for discovering.
Bandcamp.
Bandcamp is better. Yeah, Bandcamp is more artist oriented, and I'm not judging you, because I think that Spotify is a great place to discover new artists, and it's a great place. Sometimes it's great to play in the background, but we artists get almost nothing from Spotify. I say in the book here that Spotify, I had 225 unique listens for one 3-month period, and I got paid the princely sum of 10 cents. And that is usual. In fact, 10 cents is a lot. So yeah, so don't depend on streaming, please. If you want to support artists, please download our stuff and come to our concerts.
So it's about time to wrap up. And, the last chapter kind of thing. Which I loved your last chapter.
Did you like the last chapter? Shall I read it?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of working with Catherine B. Forrest to edit the book. She wrote A Curious Wine, Daughters of a Coral Dawn. Think the world of her. She edited all my books, and she said, Jamie, you really should have a last chapter. So here it is, the last chapter. My editor said I needed a final chapter to wrap things up. Here it is, the end.
So I guess the last question I have, because you answered that you don't write fiction, which I'm sort of wondering in the back of my mind, maybe you will at some point.
I have considered it.
Mhm.
I mean, I got a lot of books in me, so
Yeah,
we'll
well, that
see.
was going to be my question to wrap it up. Is what's your next book going to be about?
Well, I have thought about fiction, but what's immediate, and I've been sort of testing this idea out with friends, I think I want to write a book called Gigs from Hell. And I want to interview musicians and find out those weird gigs that you had, because we have had some pretty strange things happen to us, and it can be entertaining, it can be funny, it can be tragic, all those things that make a good book. And also, I belong to a Facebook group called Gigs from Hell, and they post things all the time that I think, oh, that should be in a book. So I might write that. I've also thought about fiction, and I would probably write what I know. I mean, my characters would probably be musicians, but still, I think it would be fun.
Yeah, I've got a story that if you write that book, that I'll give you about a gig from hell, but it involved a gun and it was very scary.
Crap, I have one about a gun too.
You do? Okay,
Yes,
well, we'll
I
talk.
do.
We'll talk. We'll do coffee talk.
I'm
So do you have anything else, Jamie, that you want to close out with, or does anybody else have a final question?
Well, if I could just do another, pitch for my book, Drive All Day. It's a collection of stories from the road. I talk about women's music festivals. I talk about Spotify. I talk about my students. We didn't really get to that, but I love teaching, and I've had some really interesting, fun students, and I write about them. And then, of course, we mentioned my other 2 books too.
Yeah. And so what we want to make sure people know who are watching at home is that they can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Drive All Day, because I'm too old to drive all night, from Charis. You can also buy Jamie's other books from Charis. We would love for you to do that. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us, just like not supporting Spotify doesn't help, music artists. Buying books from independent bookstores is the way to go. And for folks who are physically here with us tonight, you get first dibs on signed books, but I bet Jamie will sign a few extras so we can send them out to our virtual watchers. We really appreciate you being with us. Thanks so much for spending your evening with us. We're going to say goodbye to all of you watching virtually.